Welcome to In the Ven Zone with Christine McKay, where we get candid about what it takes to negotiate effectively. You'll learn from the challenges and successes of entrepreneurs, executives, and experts. We help you change the nature of your negotiations and get more from every deal you do.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another awesome episode of In the Ven Zone, where we help you, the small and mid-sized business, elevate your negotiation skills. And we do that by bringing awesome guests to you. And today is no exception. Today, I have Michael Reddington. And when we talked before in our pre-interview, I actually was super transparent with him and said, I'm a little skeptical. How does a forensic interviewer, right, certified forensic interviewer and negotiation come together? Well, he's going to help us get a better understanding of that. And I've listened to a couple of things that he's done before, and he's got some great insights. And so as a negotiator for your organization, or even if you're negotiating just in your personal life, which hint you actually are all the time, I think Michael's going to have some great stuff for us today. And so he is a certified forensic interviewer, and he is the president of the company InQuasive. So Michael, thank you for being here. So excited to have you.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So tell us how did you become a certified forensic interviewer, and what the heck does that, what is it? What is that?
Well, completely and totally by accident, and then I'll answer the second question. So believe it or not, my career actually started out as a teacher. I started out working with 7th and 8th grade special needs students and coaching baseball, and thought that would be all I would ever do. But I had friends making a lot more money, and I was susceptible to peer pressure. So I was talked into trying the financial industry, where I lasted for 2 years, 1 month, and 2 days to be exact, and decided that was it for me. So I juggled any number of random part-time jobs, which we can laugh about later. And one of them was in investigations. Again, noticing a pattern. A friend of mine said, "Hey, you need another job?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Come work with me." I said, "Okay." And now fast forward almost 20 years, here you and I are. So my career in investigations was a part-time job that got completely and totally out of control. And it hit the 4-alarm fire level, if that's the right analogy to use, the first time I was asked to interrogate somebody. And I know when people hear the word interrogation, they generally have one of two reactions. Some people are like, "Cool, tell me more." And the rest are like, "Stay away from me." There's not a lot of middle ground between the two. But the first time I was asked to interview somebody who had stolen from the company that they worked for, I tripped and fell and stumbled and bumbled and ended up getting a confession into some of their theft. I'm sure there's more that they did that they didn't tell me. But I at least was able to confirm some of their theft. And to me, I was like, well, that was interesting. And I had a supervisor at the time who is still a great friend of mine. So if he listens to this, I can jokingly say he either believed in me or was lazy. But in either way, he was like, "Why don't you start doing the interrogation so I don't have to come down?" And I got sent to my first interrogation training program. And that's where the clouds parted and the rainbows came out and the sun shined, and this is for me. And so I pursued it, For me, as I look at interrogation, it's like a mechanic who just has to know how every component of a car works. Just knowing that I had a technique that would work wasn't enough. For me, I was really fascinated with, why do people sit down with complete strangers with absolutely opposing interests and motivations and choose to commit, not comply, but commit to sharing sensitive information that brings consequences associated with that. So I dove into the research, really not just in interview and interrogation, but across the spectrum of business communication. On the interrogation side, really that specific education for me culminated with earning the Certified Forensic Interviewer designation, which is a designation like a CPA for accounting. It's not necessarily a job in and of itself. It's a designation of expertise in the field. The way that I like to explain it is, a certified forensic interviewer should be able to get dropped out of a helicopter into any conversation and conduct a morally, legally, and ethically sound investigative interview. So that's really the background that we come from. But for me, even beyond earning the CFI, as I continued my research, especially on the business communication side, I made two key realizations that just changed my direction entirely. The first is that the very best leaders and the very best interrogators capitalize on the same two core skills, vision and influence. And believe it or not, the cognitive process that interrogation suspects experience when they commit to truly saying I did it is essentially identical to the cognitive processes that customers experience when they commit to saying I'll buy it, and employees experience when they commit to saying I'll do it. All we're doing is moving people from some level of resistance to commitment, but it's called these different things in these areas or professions. So for me, that was it. I stepped away full-time from interrogation. I still do it occasionally because I think it's fun. But the vast majority of what I do now is I serve as an executive resource, and I teach people how to apply strategic, ethical, observation, and persuasion techniques with our disciplined listening method. So I don't want to take away from your time, but hopefully that answers the initial question.
Oh, hey, you're not taking away from my time. This is the audience's time. This is good stuff. So one of the things that you talked about in the podcast that I listened to, I think it was the Sales Evangelist podcast, and that I thought just really hit home kind of for me, just even taking what you've just said today about how you got to where you're at, that just summarizes it, was this notion that we should be looking for intelligence. We should be looking for intelligence, not information. And I just loved that, because one of the things that I love to talk about, and by the way, so for everybody who's listening, you can go to venn.zone, and you'll be able to get the show notes, and you'll find all of Michael's information in there and all the good stuff. And we've got a gift waiting there for you too. So if you go to venn.zone, you can check that out. But I talk a lot about effective questioning and how to use effective questions. And I have a mentor named Blair Dunkley, and a lot of people have heard about him on the show. He's been a guest on the show, and he's just a master at effective questioning. And I took a course from him recently, which is called Igniting the Buying Conversation. And it's really a sales course, but you don't sell. There is no selling. And it is the same. It's a similar in concept, I think, to what you talk about in gather intelligence and not information. Tell us more about that.
So see if I can get this concise. I love the question, and I'm going to write down Blair's name and go back and watch that episode. I did watch a few of your episodes to prep, but I didn't get that one. So I'll go back and make sure I watch. So when we get into whether it's a sales conversation like you just referenced, whether it is a negotiation, formal or otherwise, or whether it's like a performance management conversation within our own organization, it is very easy, and we can circle back to this as we go, it's very easy for us to set expectations based on our perspective, our lens. And then if we have a destination in mind where we're thinking, okay, this is where I know I want to be at the end of the conversation, it's very easy for us to fall into a verification mentality, as opposed to a learning mentality. So, and this is how this is part of where the difference between information and intelligence comes in. So if I'm in this, verification mentality, I'm thinking, okay, this is where I want to be at the end of the conversation. So I just need to hear Christine say these 2 or 3 or 4 things. In sales, it might be the stereotypical, what's their pain? Or in negotiation, it might be, what's their interest or their priority? And as soon as I hear that piece of information, then I'm going to fit it into my predetermined box that I've built onto how I'm going to pitch this idea to somebody. And when we do that, we end up literally just listening for information, check the box, and verifying what we already believed. We kick ourselves out of that learning mentality, and we're not listening for intelligence. And often the intelligence, the more valuable components of the information, can be unexpected. It can be in the tone or delivery in somebody's message. It can be in their word choice. I was just working with a group the other day, and one of the things that we talked about is if we're talking with somebody in another organization and they say, we have all met and agreed this is the direction we need to go, that means one thing. If they say, I guess we have to do this, that means something entirely different. But if we're in this verification mentality, we hear that as check, here we go. Now we're delivering what we wanted in a way that could be completely suboptimal based on the mindset that somebody else is in. So being able to capture whether it's the nonverbal behavior accurately, not falling prey to all these myths that we've all been force-fed, picking up on the tone of voice, the word choice, the volume, speed of delivery changes, all of these things within the greater context, having that situational awareness, all of that creates intelligence. And really the starting point for that is understanding not just where I want to be at the end of this conversation, but what are my greater alternatives? Like, instead of just being myopically focused on this is what I have to get, what are the greater alternatives we can achieve, and how can these potential nuances I pick up on maybe open the door to a better opportunity than I'm originally thinking? Or if the opportunity I'm originally thinking isn't there, even is there another like step in the right direction that a nuance opens up, and I can take that door today and then come back, a week, a month, whenever later, and start working my way towards the opportunity I wanted.
There are a couple things in there that I really like. So one is around kind of the listening aspect. So I talk about how listening is a full body activity. It's not something that just happens with your ears. I mean, I'll use an example of when somebody walks into a room, the clothes that they're wearing, are they wearing a perfume or cologne? How are they walking? What's their gait like? Those are all communication cues. And so often people don't pay attention to those communication cues, because you're right, they're so focused on what it is that they want to say that they're just not open to exploring what the other person is communicating to them, even before their mouths are even open. And the other part, and you may have listened to more recent episodes than Blair's, because Blair's was a while ago, but the episode that I did with Jeff Harry and Lauren Yee on play and bringing play to the negotiation table, where curiosity, what you're really talking about is curiosity. And when we're asking questions and already preceding what we think they're going to say, and we're anticipating what we're going to say, we're losing that opportunity to be curious, which is curiosity. I mean, being persuasive is really about embracing that curiosity. Talk a little bit more about that.
I couldn't agree more. For me, one of the things that makes me stop in my tracks is when I hear somebody say, I've got it all figured out. You do. Really? Explain this to me. I think we're both from the same general area, or spent time in the same general area in the Northeast. So sarcasm is my native tongue. And I almost got myself in trouble in one investigation where literally on the phone, they told me, we don't have any evidence. We don't have time to do the investigation. We need you to come in and interrogate this guy. And if you can get him to confess, we're going to fire him. But if you can't, we're going to make him vice president. Okay, I'll see you Thursday. So I go in and I'm sitting with their VP of risk and their investigations team that 2 days ago told me they don't have any evidence. And one of the guys looks at me and says, all right, so we got it all figured out. A lot changed in 2 days. So I looked at him and I said, you do? And he said, yes. And here's where my sarcastic mouth got me in trouble. I said, great. So you've been participating in the fraud. And they talk about cartoon, like red face, eyes, smoke out of his ears. It didn't go too far. I was like, let me ask you a question. Rhetorically, who knows more about any incident, the criminal that perpetrated it or the investigator that's investigating it? Like, unless you were there, there's questions we don't have the answers to. We've got to learn more. And the same thing happens with sales teams. The same thing happens with negotiators, with leaders. We've got it all figured out. We don't. We never do. We might get close, but we never do. So forcing ourselves to maintain that learning mentality is so important. And I know you love questions. One of the things that I love to say is questions can be perceived as invitations or attacks. And if they're perceived as an invitation, people will generally open up. If they're perceived as an attack, people will typically get defensive. So asking questions with that, not just curious mindset, but with that curious tone. So it doesn't come across as I'm lining you up for what I'm going to do next. That I literally ask it with curiosity in a way that helps people protect their self-image and literally let them feel like they're educating me. Even better if I already know some of the answer, because now that can serve as a functional ground truth, and I can use that to assess the direction of this conversation and to the degree they're being transparent with me. So we literally have to force ourselves to keep that curious mentality, because I mean, I'm not the scientist, but our brains are literally wired to confirm what we already think and believe So,
Oh, yeah.
so to look for information that contradicts that, it takes that intentional effort. There's a little rule that I like to follow where if I talk to somebody for at least 10 minutes and didn't learn at least one thing, that's a me problem. Like I probably wasn't open to learning for whatever reason in that conversation.
Yeah, my rule is if I walk away going, that was the best conversation ever, I go, oh, you talk too much. Because usually that's the case. So somebody will say that to me. They'll go, oh, Christine, this is the best conversation ever. And I'm like, yeah, because you did all the talking.
Yeah.
And people love to hear themselves talk.
Who
Now, one
doesn't?
of the things I do want to talk about is because I think that so from an interrogation perspective, and we all know Chris Voss is huge in the market right now, and that's great. He's done some great things. He and I have some very different perspectives. So one of my philosophies about negotiation is that negotiation is a conversation about a relationship, and you cannot win a relationship, but you can get more value out of it. And I've always had this thing, and just to the audience in full transparency, one of my kind of reluctances about having you on the show was really about not wanting to mix this concept of interrogation, because we have so many people, including in Hollywood, who position negotiation as an interrogation. It's all about getting somebody. It's all about getting them to, winning more and all those kind of things. Versus my philosophy, after almost 30 years of negotiating experience across the globe, saying no, in business, because I'm not talking about criminals, I'm not talking about hostage crisis. You would not want me negotiating a hostage crisis. I don't want hostage negotiators negotiating multi-billion-dollar transactions either, right? Two very different skill sets. Talk a little bit about your view of interrogation versus negotiation, where you see them overlapping and how you see them being different.
So much there. So great question. There are very important similarities and differences. First, I want to take a step back and address kind of just an offhand comment you made about Hollywood. And I probably should have said this earlier. If people saw videos of mine and my former teammates' interrogations, they would probably shut them off within the first 5 minutes, because it has none of the theatrical entertainment confrontational value that Hollywood forces on us. And unfortunately, like many industries, when interrogation makes the news, it's for all of the wrong reasons. And that is, a fraction of a percent of interrogations and interrogators go that way. And one of the other things I love to hear you say is the difference between like a hostage negotiation and a business negotiation. Now, I've never done a hostage negotiation, so I want to make it clear there. But there are contextual factors that are super important when you look at fields of operation. There are going to be common pieces that are going to contribute to success across the board. And then there's going to be specific pieces and opportunities that are going to be more effective in individual context. So super happy to hear that. For me, interrogations, much like negotiations, are all about achieving commitment over compliance. Compliance is essentially obeying a command. And oftentimes, whether it's parents, leaders, negotiators, salespeople, whoever, we feel like, okay, we told them what to do and they said they'd do it, so we win. And we don't realize the resentment that builds and the potential sabotage it might set up earlier, or how this, cut off your nose to spite your face, as my mom told me a million times when I was growing up, how all of these things can happen. Commitment occurs when somebody is able to at least take some idea ownership of the decision, because they've been able to line their self-image up with their decision. I come from a world of non-confrontational interview and interrogation, which is a very, very big differentiator. And I would like to say all, but it's probably too broad a statement. The vast, vast, vast majority of the interrogations I've ever participated in look and felt like a regular conversation. And they just happen to end most of the time with one person writing a written statement to whatever it is they said or did at the end. Other than that, just feels like a regular conversation. The number one component, the motor that makes those interrogations work, is allowing people to save face and protect their self-image. The motor, the number one reason that allows people to come to agreements in most contexts is having the opportunity to save face and protect our self-image. So just looking at those key components, there are very real alignments when you look at having a conversation with people that may to some degree have juxtaposed intentions, goals, motivations, fears, whatever. But the process of obtaining the truth, the information that we really need, and then executing an agreement at the end is going to be driven in large part by our ability to help the people we speak with save face and protect their self-image throughout the conversation. How we prepare to do that, how we engage in a way to do that, and how we follow up after the conversation to maintain that is going to be very important between the two. Something that happens in a lot of interrogations that shouldn't happen in a negotiation would be the accusation. But there are even ways to accuse people where there are some accusation techniques, soft accusation techniques I will use in some negotiations, but I'm not accusing somebody of anything. It's like interrogating the process instead of the person. So if it's a manufacturing deal, I'm not going to ask them if they can manufacture 5,000 items in the next 6 months. I'm going to ask them, how long will it take? How long does it typically take to manufacture 5,000 units? And just let them answer that question and go from there. So in theory, I'm accusing them of being able to manufacture 5,000 units, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
But now that same kind of soft accusation, assumptive style question, not used at the close, but used at some of the procedural components, helps us acquire more information and intelligence along the way.
That's really interesting. Yeah, we talked briefly in the pre-interview about kind of when somebody is lying to you at the negotiation table, which obviously in your situations as an interrogator, when you were doing that work, people would absolutely be lying to you. And we had a little bit of different, I mean, I do it differently depending on the person. So it's 100% dependent on the person who I'm engaged with and how that person is reacting, responding, and whether or not I think that I'll be able to discover the truth without being without being confrontational. An example I use, and this is from a number of years ago, so I've matured a lot as a negotiator over this time too. But I remember when I was younger, I was negotiating with SAP. And huge, for those who don't know, SAP is just this huge technology company, enterprise resource planning tools with like links into it's a massive company, German company, massive, their customers are massive. And I was negotiating a deal for a large oil and gas company. And they came in and they said, no, whatever, we can't do this because there's a revenue recognition issue. And I'm like, okay, well, that just scratch head because I know enough about finance. I'm like, this doesn't make sense to me. And they just wouldn't back off of it. And we tried asking questions in a different way. So I literally went and I pulled their financial report, just their 10K. And in their 10K was what their revenue recognition policy was. And so it had hit a point where I literally took the annual report into my next meeting and I put it on the table and I said, here's your revenue recognition policy. What you're telling me is inaccurate. And because what we're asking for does not violate your stated revenue recognition policy. So for me, it was a really kind of a moment, and it actually was a watershed moment in the negotiation because it kind of put them on notice. And he was much older than I was. And so there was a huge imbalance of power perspective. And he kind of just thought he was going to get one over on me. And I'm like, no, we're not going to play that game that way. So kind of how would you handle that kind of situation versus what I did, which was some might say that was confrontational. It wasn't like we were screaming and yelling at each other. It's like, I'm going to name this. I'm going to call it out to Blair Dunkley's language. I'm going to name and label it. This is what it is. And how would you deal with something like that when somebody's lying to you?
Yeah, a couple of answers there. First, I wouldn't classify that as confrontational. I think the act of going, first of all, I love it. The situational awareness, the access, the ability, we talk about using the truth to your advantage. We know that the truth is out there. How do we use it to our advantage?
Mhm.
So I love all of that. The confrontational aspect could have occurred with how it was presented. Like just
Mhm.
presenting it itself is not confrontational. How it's presented is what could have made it confrontational. And to me, it doesn't sound like those lines were crossed from what I'm hearing. So I like that. I promise I'll get back to answering your question. There's generally, I heard you say, the guy felt like he had more power. If we think about it, and I'm putting my toes into your world a little bit, so correct me everywhere I need to be corrected.
Okay.
When we think about like the general concept of power in negotiations, probably the oldest one is who's the biggest dog in the fight. And that could be the size of the company, how many years or experience somebody has, how much money somebody has, their political position, all of those things. And then I know you are quite familiar with the BATNA concepts. It changed from, okay, well, whoever's the biggest dog in the fight to whoever has the best, in my simple language, plan B, whoever is willing to walk away and understands their best alternative to that negotiated agreement. For me, and one of the things I loved about your story too, was the representing the underdogs and fighting for the underdogs. That's a huge part of where I come from as well. And oftentimes in the underdogs, not only do we not have the big dog position, we might not even have a great BATNA. We might have a BATNA, but we might not have a great BATNA. So in that situation, really developing the ability to influence is where our power comes from in any negotiation or conversation. And to me, it sounds like that was an operationalization, if that's the right use of a word I may have just made up, of that approach, where maybe the size may or may not have been an issue with the organization. Maybe the BATNA was there or wasn't there. So how are we going to influence somebody's thought process to commit them to seeing things from a different perspective and moving this conversation forward? Bam, you found the information and used it. So I love that. For me, one of the biggest lessons and most important lessons I learned in the world of interview and interrogation is people are supposed to lie to you. It's cool. Like we all established this, I shouldn't say we all, many of us are brought up to have this like moral and ethical attachment to lying, and lying is evil. Yet we're all liars to some degree. And there is research that shows that pro-social lies actually, in some contexts, do a much better job building trust than the truth does. So there are plenty of opportunities where lying not only is wrong, but maybe morally appropriate if people didn't just crash their car hearing that statement. So there's plenty of research that shows that far more often than not, when people lie, they're not lying to hurt you. They're lying to protect themselves or somebody else. Done. So the very first thing for me is when somebody lies to you is to realize that's what they thought was their last good decision in the moment. It was the last good choice they feel like they had. So let's not get mad about it. Let's stop and think. The vast majority of people, adults, taking away like the medical diagnosis, the vast majority of adults will lie for one reason: to avoid a consequence that is either real or perceived. So for me, the lie is not important. The consequence they're trying to avoid with the lie is important. So if we maintain a curious mentality and an elevated level of situational awareness, when we start to believe that we have somebody who's being less than honest with us, many times I'm going to let that go and I'm going to focus on the motivation of their lie. And I'm going to address that motivation and not confront them on being a liar. We have found, and there may or may not be research to support this, I should probably go back and double check, but at least through experience, it is way easier, exponentially easier to get somebody to admit to saying I did it than it is to get them to admit to being their fault. And if we go for it's my fault and I did it at the same time, we're going for two admissions instead of one. And the it's my fault is actually harder for people to say than the I did it. Now, if we're going to triple down and try to get the I did it, it's my fault, and I previously lied about it, good luck. Because nobody likes being called a liar. Norman Anderson did a research study where he may have overshot it, but he had people categorize how 555 different words or labels would make them feel if they were called these words or had these labels put on them. You want to take a guess what word came in ranked 555th?
Liar.
Liar. If I got it right, 6 of the bottom 10 were some derivation of dishonest, and 4 of the top 10 were some derivation of honest. Nobody likes being called a liar, especially liars. So while there are certainly contextually appropriate examples to call somebody on it in different ways to do it, more often than not, if they're trying to protect their self-image, I'm going to let it slide and then come back and address the motivation, whether I do it now or later as you did, because the motivation, the consequence they're trying to avoid is really the most important piece we have to address.
There's a really great TED Talk by a woman named Pamela Meyer, who I'm trying to get on this show, called How to Spot a Liar. And I mean, the average human being lies between 10 and 100 times a day. And I mean, her research is just amazing, and it's a great TED Talk. And so I highly recommend everybody go listen to it, because lying, it is part of humanity. And I mean, I love, I agree with you 100% the way you put it, right? When somebody's lying to you, especially in a negotiation, it's because they are trying to protect a self-interest. And so, and don't get mad about it, right? It's what's the value of getting mad about it? Just figure out what's the rationale behind it, what's causing them to do that, what is it that they are afraid of that is pushing them to behave in that way. And don't judge the person, look at the behavior and figure out how do we create something, how do we create a solution that makes that fear either go away or reduces it or addresses it or gives them comfort that negative outcome that they most likely perceive. Because most of the time when we lie, our perception of what would happen if we told the truth is far worse than what actually would happen. So what is that? And really kind of explore that. I like that a lot. So tell us about something that you in the course of what you've been doing that has surprised you. What have you learned about interrogation and what you've done that's really surprised you? And when you see it, you go, God, I still can't believe that that's the way that is.
So that might be the hardest question for me to answer that I've ever been asked. I love it. You know, I'm a geek. If I turn the screen off here and showed you the floor of my office, it is currently covered in research papers that are like neatly organized in different topics. So for me, I'm a nerd, and I've got some additional resources based on some things I've heard you mention that I'll send you after. So I think for me, I probably have to go back to something that I already said that was the most surprising and then go from there. The thing that knocked me off my feet, figuratively, thankfully, was when I realized the cognitive process that leads people to say I did it is essentially the same that leads people to say I'll do it and I'll buy it. For me, that was the one that had me go, wait a minute, because I got into investigations by accident. My first management role in that industry, I literally called my parents after I took it and said, I'm moving to Connecticut. It's just going to be a year. I got to get this on my resume. Then I'll come back and do something else. When I got to Connecticut, they said, if you do a good job, don't worry, we'll promote you and we'll move you back to Boston. Don't even worry about it. Done. 364 days later, they sent me to New Jersey. So I let other people decide if that was a promotion or not. All my friends in New Jersey just rolled their eyes. But
everybody in New Jersey just rolled their eyes.
New Jersey's a beautiful state. I was there a couple weeks ago.
It's a gorgeous state. I love New Jersey.
It's like 4 states in one. A lot of people don't know
it is.
So now that I backtrack to try not to offend all of your listeners in New Jersey, I got into investigations by accident. So all of my persuasive communication and evaluation techniques and questioning techniques, they all were born in that investigative interviewing world. So as I started to interact with people from business worlds and attended a seminar at your alma mater that opened my eyes to a lot of the similarities, that to me, that was like, wait a minute, there is so much more to this. And there are perspectives and ideas and techniques that people just aren't sharing because there's these fences built between interrogators and everybody else. And so we've got to start bridging those fences. So I'm kind of cheating by going back to something that I've already said, but that to me by far was the most surprising. And to try to give you a second answer to that question, there are still times where, I laugh and my wife will do it as well. where, we'll kind of laugh and be like, I can't believe that still works. And for me, one of the phrases that we live by, to get back to questions, is illustrate before you investigate. Demonstrate some sort of understanding of the situation, of the person you're, in this case, negotiating with, their perspective, before we ask the question. Because if we want anybody to say or do anything, I don't have the science to back this up, so this is my belief, 85% of that battle at least is helping align their self-image with what we want them to think, say, or do. The science is clear that we have this fiendish need to remain consistent with how we see ourselves thinking, acting, and behaving in any given situation. So if we want someone to change how they think, behave, or act, we really have to line their self-image up with that change before we ask them to do it. So that illustrate before we investigate is probably the one that to this day will make me smile, or the one that I'll feel my wife kind of nudge me when we're out together, where not only will you be surprised what people will say and do just when you're nice to them, including confess to committing some pretty serious crimes, but you'll also be surprised the shifts they'll be willing to make when we give them the opportunity to save face and align their self-image with whatever it is we're asking them to do first.
Hey, everybody. We're sitting here listening to Michael Reddington. I'm so excited to have him on the show. Certified forensic investigator and president of InQuasive. So, and just go to venn.zone, VENN.zone, and you can check out the show notes. So that I love that. I love that illustrate. I love that concept. How do you do that so if you're somebody, negotiation is about, from a negotiator's perspective, right? Because our skill sets are slightly different and overlap, but still slightly different. So as a negotiator, if you listen to Chris Voss, he has a very different, he and I have opposite views on this. He actually goes to no. He's like, because that gives in his perception as a hostage negotiator, no, giving the terrorist or the hostage taker the authority to say no creates power for that person when they have or don't have power. But for me, as a business negotiator, negotiation is about accumulating yeses. And the more yeses I can accumulate faster, the easier it is to deal with conflict, which is inevitable in any relationship if you believe negotiation is a conversation about a relationship. So when you talk about kind of the illustration component, how do people do that? Well, how do you create that alignment when how do you create that alignment? What's your experience in that?
So many different. And I want to continue the conversation even offline at some point, because a couple other ideas I can share with you. So I guess I'll just say it this way and I'll work my way into it. What you're seeing now is like 5 competing chains of thoughts eating up all the available brain cells that I have at the moment. So I'll do it this way. I'm guessing that you and many of your audience is likely familiar with Robert Cialdini's work.
Yes.
The godfather of influence and persuasion.
Absolutely.
To your listeners, if you haven't read his stuff, stop, put me on pause, not Christine, but put me on pause. Go listen to his stuff and then come back. We'll put that his book in. We'll put a link to Cialdini's book. He's amazing. He's one of my heroes. So yeah, definitely on my short list of people I would love to have a conversation with. So through his work, and you're familiar, he has a 7 automatic mechanisms of persuasion. And with this illustrate before we investigate technique, here's something I'd love to talk to him about. I think it's easy to argue we're using at least 3 of them and potentially even 5 of them when we do this. So believe it or not, oftentimes the word you is one of the most dangerous words in the English language because it's directly attached to our self-image. So if you and I are negotiating and I'm sitting here standing, Christine, I'm sure in this situation, you are likely focused on maximizing the opportunity for your group. And you likely are worried about having your team come back and say, how did this happen? And I'm sure you do want a good agreement, but at the same time, it has to be on your terms for your organization. Every time I say the word you, I'm just attacking your self-image. Now, if we have a great relationship, it's not so risky. It'll be longer for that damage to start accumulating. But if we don't, it's like a boxer taking body shots. It's not too long before that becomes a real problem. So one of the things we do, there's a funnel analogy that I like to use in a lot of different places, but specifically when we talk about illustrate before we investigate, we don't use the word you until we ask the question at the bottom of the funnel. Everything else is illustrative on top of that, where we use social proof. And we use labels, to steal a word that you used earlier, that people like to be included in because of the power of in-groups and out-groups and protecting self-image and not feeling personally attacked and all those things. So in this also enhances the perception of our credibility, because it doesn't sound like this is the only time I've ever had this conversation. It sounds like this is something we do often. So we're helping them protect our self-image. We're injecting social proof. We're leveraging consistency. We are building our credibility. And there is some reciprocity and liking that works in this as well, including scarcity. Because if nobody's ever talked to them this way before, it's not the offer that's scarce, it's our relationship that is scarce. And since negotiation is all about a relationship, if there is scarcity within our relationship, not in that we're threatening to take it away or talking about what a unicorn we are, but actually talking with people in a way that they've never been engaged with before, now we are, in a very credible way, using scarcity as well. So an example of this could be, to kind of go back to the very vague and general example I did before, could be, we know from experience at this point in the conversation, when the deals are on the table and being considered, that each organization has to look through it from their lens and the opposite person's lens at the same time. So they have to start weighing what's best for our organization, what's best for our reputation, what's best for our greater goals, while to some degree trying to account for what is good for the other organization's greater goals as well. And where do we have the opportunity to still try to connect those regardless of the preconceived notions we brought into the conversation. So with that in mind, Christine, as we look at what we've currently discussed, where do we think we may still have room for even a little bit more conversation? It's not perfect. I made it up off the top of my head. An investigative example of that is, for my former teammates and I, the vast majority of times when we got called in, we were given cases with multiple suspects, no evidence. Everybody had already been interrogated at least once and denied. A couple of weeks or months have gone by, and now the fire is so far out of control, they need someone else to come in. And in one particular case, there was a series of abuse that was being enacted. I just lost my words for a second. Two managers within one organization were literally abusing another man that worked at the organization. They'd already been interviewed. They'd already been denied. 8 weeks go by. I go in. I talk to the victim first. He's absolutely telling me the truth. There's no two ways about it. It was an emotionally exhaustive conversation for me to even be a part of. Now I got to sit down and talk with these two guys one at a time, of course. So when I sit down with the first guy, who was the senior ranking of the two suspects, I know he's already been interviewed before. I can see that he's this close to telling me the truth, but he's not doing it yet. It finally dawns on me that the reason why he's not telling me the truth is he's already lied to the previous investigators that talked to him. So telling me the truth essentially means admitting to being a liar. So instead of saying, I know you already lied to the first team of investigators, it's okay to tell me the truth. I will never get the truth after that, ever. So instead, and I should have probably watched the video before I realized I was going to use this example, give or take within a word or two, what I said was, oftentimes when we come in after people think investigations have been concluded, people believe that means that all the evidence has been collected and all the conversations have been had, and therefore they need to stick to whatever explanations they've previously given. Thankfully, we come in from the outside to give people the opportunity to capitalize on the ongoing investigation and be more forthcoming about what happened and, more importantly, why, so we can do the most important thing, which is start putting it behind us. And as I said that, you literally see him start to do the math in his head, like nodding his head, eyes going side to side, like, well, I guess it's okay for me too. And right after that is when he started telling me the truth. And thankfully snitched on the other guy that was participating in this with him as well. So that concept of helping people save face, protect their self-image, illustrate before we investigate is core to everything that we do.
Wow. That's a really cool story. I like that story a lot. I think that it's really interesting because, the there are times, and I shared this story recently on the Jeff Yee Jeff Harry and Lauren Yee episode. And this was a situation where, in the context of that show, we were talking about it in terms of taking risks, and about play as adults is not just about, child's play. It's about being curious and taking risks to move things along, in conversation in particular. And I shared a story, and I'll share it again because I'm curious about your reaction to this story. So I had been negotiating with a large professional services company, and the guy was a terrible. It was just a terrible situation. He was aggressive. He wouldn't get on the phone. He would just send emails that just were full of attacking language and personal attacking language. And it wasn't just me that he treated that way. He treated everybody that way. He was just an abusive human being. And it was really, and the deal situation was, the deal that they had, it was part of a merger, divestiture actually. And the contract that was in place with the company prior made no sense. It didn't mirror anything about how anything worked. He just did not want to negotiate. And he just wanted it all to stay exactly the same. He didn't want to make any modifications to it, but it didn't make any sense. And so we kept going round and round and round, trying to get this guy to the negotiation table. And every time we would try, he'd come back with this just vitriol. And so it turned out that we had a number of common connections in our network. And so I reached out to those common connections, and their reaction was, "I'm really sorry you have to deal with this guy." And so after one, I finally, the straw broke the camel's back for me. And I was like, okay, we are getting nowhere. We've been trying to engage this guy for 6 months. Nothing is happening. We've tried escalating it. My executive team has tried escalating it. It just was a mess. So he sent me a terrible email, and I responded back, "It's nice to know that our mutual acquaintances are correct about you." And that was all I said. The next morning I get into the office, he had sent a 5 or 6 page email to the chairman of the board, to the president, the CEO, the senior vice presidents of sales and distribution. I'm never going to deal with her. But we got into the negotiation table, right? So now, I didn't actually tell my bosses that I was going to take that tact, but I did it anyway. And so what happened was, I removed myself from interfacing with him, but I was still running the whole negotiation. And he was in Ireland. And so my chief counsel would be on the phone, and I'd hit mute and tell my counselor, this is what to say. This is what he's saying. So the same process took place, but I, being from Montana, I stepped on the rattlesnake, because it's like, what do I do when I'm getting stonewalled so hard, and he's so angry all the time? How do I feel that anger to get a reaction so that we can maybe loosen something up to move forward? What's your reaction to that as kind of a tactic, and kind of your thoughts around that?
Again, I believe I love it. And I love it not only because of how you did it, but when you did it. So for me, one of the things I love to do is let people declare, let there be no doubt. So if somebody is being angry, aggressive, or bully, whatever word you want to use at the beginning of the conversation, maybe this is about me, maybe this is about the issue, the conversation is their default style, or maybe they've had a really terrible day. Mm-hmm. And the next email, 5 minutes later, the next phone call might be a little bit different. So I am going to look at it as, okay, I'm winning. Because if you're emotional and you're upset and you feel like this narrow juvenile path is the only path that you can take, then I'm winning, because I still have lots of other opportunities and you've kind of locked yourself in. Generally, I'm a big believer that the best way to maintain control of any conversation is to let the other person feel like they have it. Because if we get into this wrestling where we're trying to wrestle control from each other, now we're not trying to add value. We're trying to win, to wrestle control. So if I'm not perceived as trying to wrestle control from somebody, they don't have to wrestle it from me. If they don't have to wrestle it for me, now I can be patient. I can let the conversation come to me. I can leverage my situational awareness, and I can use great questions or smart illustrations and just kind of nudge it over time where I want to go. And then a lot of times, maybe it's something we can talk about later too, is the more time we allow ourselves, which isn't always in our control, of course, but the more time we allow ourselves in a negotiation process, the less stress and pressure we feel. So therefore, the more we can use these techniques. And a lot of times people don't realize that as an underdog, time is a great equalizer. The more time we can build into this, the more alternatives we have, and the more we can start building leverage into this conversation. So for me, pushing back, for all our listeners here in the United States, especially in the South, for Texas residents, it's the Alamo. It's where we make our last stand. It's where we fight and die. I've exhausted every other option. I've let it go. I've offered additional value. I love the resourcefulness I'm hearing. Go to your network. What other options are there? Other people of influence that I might be able to get involved here? No. Well, I clearly can't make the situation any worse than I already have. I'm glad my contacts feel the same way that I do. Bam! And now you even make him declare further. So that was just enough of a push not to derail the entire process, but get him to declare, okay, I will negotiate, just not with you. Which the average person might be like, oh, that's so terrible. That's a huge win. Because now we got him where we want him, which is at the table, and you're still very much involved in the conversation in a behind the scenes role. So I love everything that I heard about it. I even love the fact that you didn't ask permission. You just did it because you knew it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those things. Well, I mean, and at the time, my mentality on it was I knew what I was saying, but I was curious about how he was going to label himself, right? Because everybody in the company that was divested, everybody in the company that was the divesting company, all had the same view of this person. And I was really curious to know how he labeled himself. So if somebody had sent an email to me like that, I would have said something like, oh, that's great. Who are our mutual acquaintances, right? I would have asked a different question. He dove right down to the negative, which was informative. It gave it to the, it was intelligence, right? Yeah. That was more, it was intelligence to say, this person feels very negatively about himself. And so, because his reaction was disproportionate to a one sentence email, and to spend that much energy writing 5 or 6 pages of email, complaining about me, and I'm like, dude, right? It's like,
get a helmet.
All right, but sometimes, I want the audience to know there are times, and it's not very often. I've had people throw things at me. I've had people spit at me. I've had people pat me on the head when they're trying to be condescending to me. I've had sexual advances in negotiation. All this stuff happens, right? But if you're listening, if you to not just your counterpart, but listening to yourself, right? Because it's a two-way thing. It's about Blair Dunkley talks about self, other, and situation. If you are paying attention to yourself, if you're paying attention to your counterpart, and you're paying attention to the situation that you're in, and you're processing that, then that moves you forward. That helps you move forward in the conversation. And sometimes you deal with these people who are super aggressive, and you feel, and you mentioned this in the Sales Evangelist podcast too. You're talking about comfort, and Blair talks about comfort versus safety. And a lot of times, we think that we're not safe when we're really just uncomfortable. And so, and figuring out how to resolve those situations requires some creative solutioning. There you go.
Life is a series of solvable problems. We can focus on the problem, or we could focus on the solution. And when we focus on the solution, be surprised what we can come up with.
I absolutely love that quote. Say that again, because that's so good.
Life is a series of solvable problems.
Life is a series of solvable problems.
We can choose to focus on the problem, or we can choose to focus on the solution. And a lot of times too, like in a negotiation, this is what you get for giving the microphone back to me, by the way. You can literally listen to somebody's words and figure out what mindset they're in. If you're hearing words like don't and won't, they're in a problem-focused mindset. If you're hearing words like do and will, they're in a solutions-focused mindset. So that's where, again, our ability to, and I know we've talked about this offline, to come up with a great go through a great preparation that gives us a good strategy, freedom within the framework. We know where we want to go, but we're not myopic. To then quiet our internal monologue to fully focus on what's happening in front of us with those goals in mind. The only way we can separate information from intelligence is if we have goals to tie it into. That's where the value association comes in, which is completed through our preparation.
I love it. I love it. Michael, this has been absolutely fantastic. How does the audience find you? And we're going to put all this in the show notes at ven.zone, but how do they find you?
I appreciate you asking. They can learn more about myself and the services we offer at InQuasive.com. So that's InQuasive.com. And they can find me on LinkedIn at Michael Reddington CFI. Those would be the two best places.
Fantastic. And what's some last words that you have to say to everybody who's tuning in today, whether you're listening on your favorite podcast platform or you're watching us on YouTube?
So I would leave it at this. The goal-oriented mindset makes all the difference. Stay within yourself, regulate your emotions. To your last point, no matter what tactics other people are trying to use, if we can separate the message from the messenger, if we can separate the emotions from the goal and just approach this as, these are a series of tasks that we have to complete, morally and ethically, of course, in order to negotiate the relationship and achieve our goals, then we'll be much more successful.
Fantastic. I love that. And then did you have a gift that you wanted to give? Did you have a freebie that you wanted to give away?
I do.
Yes.
If I can, I don't mean this as like a teaser for your audience, but I'd actually like to talk to you about a couple of different options and then choose the best one. So I apologize for not having a great answer.
Oh, no. Okay. I just want to make sure that I reference it. I should
have reached out before the recording.
Oh, no,
I now am
cool.
Transparent to your guests.
That's cool.
We'll put it in the show notes. My apologies.
I'm just going to tease it. That they have to go to the show notes, and there'll be a free gift from Ven Negotiation as well as from you and InQuasive. Yes. So I just want to tease that out. So, Michael, I know that you have a free gift for our audience, but we're kind of keeping it a little bit of a suspenseful thing here. So to everybody listening, if you go to ven.zone and you check out the show notes, we will have the link to a free gift from Michael and from his team at InQuasive, as well as from me and Ven Negotiation. So check out the show notes at ven.zone, and you can check out Ven Negotiation and all the things that we provide at vennegotiation.com. And I'm just really excited to have you here, Michael. Thank you so much for being here. Great conversation today. And to the audience, thank you so much for tuning in. I always appreciate the time that you spend with me on the show. It is the greatest gift that you can give me. If you like the show, please subscribe, please rate and review. We really would appreciate that. And in the meantime, I can't wait to see you next time on another episode of In the Ven Zone. And just remember, negotiation is a conversation about a relationship, and you can't win a relationship, but you can get more value out of it. Have a great day, everyone, and we'll see you again soon. Cheers.
Take care of each other. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of In the Ven Zone with Christine McKay. We invite you to visit our website at www.ven.zone to access the show notes and other helpful resources. Empower the negotiator in you and successfully level the playing field. Join us again next time here on In the Ven Zone.